Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about liberation-informed healing from traumatic experiences. If you've experienced trauma and traditional approaches haven't worked for you, this webinar is for you. This webinar will go beyond traditional notions of resilience and emphasize trauma survivors' capacity to become anti-fragile, heal, and strive, even in the face of overwhelmingly stressful environments. Today's webinar is sponsored by I'm Live Adult Webcam Experiences. Traumatic experiences can occur in a number of ways, including directly experiencing a traumatic event, witnessing in person an event as it occurs to others, learning that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend, or repeated or extreme exposure to adversive details of a traumatic event. As you can see on the slide here, there are also different subtypes of traumatic experiences. One, which is most common, is considered acute trauma. This is trauma that results from a single incident, such as a car accident, a medical illness, sudden or violent loss of a loved one, or a single physical or sexual assault. Two is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is considered repeated and prolonged trauma, such as domestic violence, early childhood abuse, or neglect, or community violence. Somewhat similar is this concept of complex trauma. Complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple trauma events. They're often in a very invasive and interpersonal nature, such as commercial sexual exploitation. And lastly, intergenerational trauma. This is trauma that's been passed down through families, such as generations of abuse or identity-based marginalization. Now, individuals can experience multiple forms of trauma, and the reactions will differ based on each person. Let's talk a little bit about how trauma impacts us. Ultimately, trauma shapes our feelings, our reactions, our core beliefs about ourselves and the world, our stability, the choices that we make, and how we navigate the world in general. Sometimes this impact shows up as being hyper-aroused and getting startled easily. So some people describe this as always having to look around a corner or waiting for something negative to happen in their lives. Others feel alienated from others or rejected from society. Constant anxiety and worry about negative things happening in the future that make it difficult to enjoy the present is a common reaction to trauma. Others experience an inability to feel positive emotions like happiness, closeness, or love. Many trauma survivors perceive others as dangerous and untrustworthy without having any evidence of the fact, primarily because they've experienced danger or lack of trust from perpetrators in the past. It's not uncommon for survivors of trauma to become easily upset or agitated at seemingly small things. We sometimes refer to this as triggers, so reminders of experiences in the past that may not be dangerous in the moment. It's also not uncommon for survivors to blame or have negative views about themselves, such as the role they might have played in the traumatic event or perceiving themselves as broken or unlovable. As a result, loss of intimacy or feeling detached from others in our lives, including romantic partners, friends, family members, and coworkers, can result. Other survivors find it difficult to engage in health behaviors like regular sleep or visits to the doctor because of some of these symptoms. And lastly, some survivors engage in excessive smoking, alcohol, drugs, sexual behavior, eating, or other behaviors that are often an attempt to cope with symptoms that have resulted from trauma. So as I mentioned, all survivors of trauma will differ in the way that they experience trauma symptoms. And it's also not uncommon for survivors to experience these symptoms, but not attribute them to trauma. Some people, as a function of avoidance, don't even know that what they've experienced in the past might be considered traumatic. It might have been their upbringing and they knew nothing else. They may only be surrounded by folks who have experienced similar trauma in their communities. Other people have had these experiences minimized or even dismissed by others. So if you're experiencing symptoms on this slide or reactions that I've described, think back to the previous slide and consider that maybe something that has happened to you, in fact, is considered a traumatic event. What I tend to describe when I'm talking about trauma is that these behaviors and reactions to trauma are actually adaptations and survival mechanisms that initially helped people stay alive. Yet in the present, they're often irrelevant and may actually increase our interpersonal vulnerability. So I encourage people to think of the 4 Fs. You may have heard of fight and flight, but I'm going to add a couple for you today. So number 1, fight. Survivors who turn to violence might be reluctant to ask for help, are distrusting of helping people and systems as a reaction to trauma. 2, flight. So these are survivors who might always be hypervigilant. They might have rigid boundaries in their relationships. They may leave people before they can be left or quit before they can be fired. Third one, freeze. So this is often when we're talking about avoidance. So people who, avoid thinking about talking about their experiences, avoid talking about, interpersonal connectivity or love. They may feel numb, they may dissociate from experiences in their lives. And lastly, fawn or fawning. So this is the concept of really keeping the peace, having lax boundaries, accepting treatment or less than what they're worth. This is particularly common for survivors of complex trauma, so prolonged exposure to trauma in different forms of trauma over their lifetime. All right, so a quote that I like to leave people with to demonstrate this concept is, being overly focused on other people's feelings, moods, and needs above your own can happen when that was exactly the strategy that kept you safe during a traumatic experience. So now let's turn to talking a bit about trauma in the adult entertainment industry. Before I talk about this slide, I want to highlight that this widely held belief that adult entertainment performers are, all survivors of childhood sexual abuse who grew up and are coerced into sexual industry is a myth. That's not the reality of this industry. In fact, research that has looked at adult entertainment workers, particularly women, these women are remarkably similar to other women in terms of their history of sexual abuse. The reality is sexual abuse is unfortunately very common among all women. More common indicators than sexual abuse of entering the adult entertainment industries are things like money, financial security, having flexible hours, sometimes the perceived glamour of the work, the relationships, and simply enjoying sex more and maybe having more sexual freedom or autonomy. Research has also found that performers typically enjoy greater mental health and well-being than the general public. So I want to emphasize that point before I talk about trauma specific to the industry. So all that being said, sex trafficking, violence, coercion, and exploitation are realities of this world, including the adult entertainment industry. Specific to the industry, performers, depending on sort of the environment that they're working in, may be exposed to a number of physical, mental, and social health risks in the line of work that they're in. These can include high-risk sexual acts that are unprotected, substance misuse, and body enhancement efforts. Some performers are exposed to physical trauma while on the film set. Many describe entering and leaving the industry with financial insecurity and suffer from mental health symptoms like anxiety and depression. In fact, many performers in research have expressed a desire to leave the industry, but an inability to do so because of financial insecurity. It is also known that female, non-binary, transgender, and performers of color are more likely to be exposed to certain health risks that I've described. And ultimately, these health risks and traumatic experiences can accumulate over time into the symptoms that I've described in the previous slide. Unfortunately, performers sometimes describe rarely speaking out when they experience this type of abuse due to fear of being blacklisted or discriminated against. Now, again, I want to make it very clear that this is not the experience for all performers, and access to good mentorship, physical and mental health care, and peer support reduce the risk significantly. Let's talk just briefly about trauma treatment, sort of this traditional notion of trauma treatment and how to recover from traumatic experiences. There are a variety of different treatments that are known to work, but there are 2 critical components of trauma treatment. The first being therapeutic exposure. So what this involves is repeated, humane confrontation of trauma reminders with really 2 goals in mind. One is to learn new, more adaptive, and realistic responses to trauma-related cues or triggers. And number two is to learn to tolerate these trauma cues and triggers rather than fear and avoid them. So most trauma reminders, certain places, songs, phrases, smells, they don't actually hold any danger in this moment, but our body responds to them in similar ways as it did during the traumatic events. The second critical component of trauma treatment is cognitive restructuring. This involves examining the cognitions, emotions, and meanings that have developed from traumatic experiences. Survivors often develop cognitive beliefs that are inconsistent with the factual information, something like self-blame or shame or guilt. So one way that cognitive restructuring can be done is through repeated recounting of trauma memories. This can be done verbally or it can be done in writing. So treatments that are known to work for PTSD recovery are cognitive processing therapy, which is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy and really focuses on this cognitive restructuring piece, looking at the thoughts that have developed after trauma. Another is prolonged exposure therapy. This is a treatment that really focuses on that therapeutic exposure element. Next, eye movement desensitization therapy also focuses quite a bit on the exposure piece, re-exposing to those memories. And lastly, our narrative exposure therapies. These ones focus more on the cognitive restructuring, but involve a component of therapeutic exposure as well as you're writing about these experiences. There are other trauma treatments that people sometimes implement based on situation, but these are the treatments that, based on evidence, we know that work for trauma recovery. On that notion of trauma recovery, more important than the treatments themselves, there's some common themes about recovering from traumatic events. What we know is that trauma lives in the body and the pain demands to be felt in some way. Survivors are always carrying around feeling and being impacted by these experiences. So avoidance, which is a common reaction to trauma, avoiding thinking about it, talking about it, it doesn't change that. It doesn't work that way. Ultimately, recovery from trauma entails that it is spoken or written or thought about in all of its horror and violation to others who can listen to it without being overwhelmed. Sometimes this comes in the form of a professional or treatment, or other times it comes from family or others with similar lived experiences. Ultimately, to integrate trauma into our lives, traumatized people must find language and symbols to express their frustrations, helplessness, disempowerment, or even humiliation that they have suffered. If we don't do this ourselves, traumatic experiences will continue to take over this language and symbols without us having any say. And lastly, fragmentation of identity caused by the rupture of trauma is healed through the construction of a narrative. So storytelling is really our greatest power and often a big part of recovery. Now, I imagine that most of you have heard of the concept of resilience after trauma, but there's been some attention to this concept of anti-fragility as an alternative to resilience. So what this term means, it recognizes that people learn to grow stronger as a result of particularly systemic stressors and trauma. So of note, developing this concept of anti-fragility or an anti-fragile mindset doesn't mean that we have to see the positive in trauma. It doesn't mean that we have to deny the horror of these experiences or the resulting feelings of anxiety and stress. Instead, it emphasizes that we can combat those feelings and respond to those feelings of anxiety and stress with opposite reactions, like relaxation, hopefulness, mindfulness, constructing a narrative. So ultimately, this concept allows us to give ourselves permission to grieve and be kind and patient to ourselves as we go through our healing journeys. Anti-fragility better prepares us to face whatever challenges come next in our lives. This great quote about anti-fragility. Some things benefit from shocks. They thrive and grow when exposed to volatility, randomness, disorder, and stressors, and love adventure, risk, and uncertainty. Yet, in spite of the ubiquity of the phenomenon, there is no word for the exact opposite of fragile. Let us call it anti-fragile. Anti-fragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The anti-fragile gets better. We've talked about some traditional treatments for trauma, as well as common factors in trauma recovery. But collective, holistic healing strategies beyond these traditional trauma treatments really must center or not center individuals as the people responsible for their own healing. So what we know is that trauma is inflicted by others. It's often systemic in nature. Yet these treatments really center individuals as the people responsible for fixing that or healing that on their own. So instead, some healing strategies that I like to outline here that go beyond that traditional notion is one, breaking cycles of intergenerational trauma. So back to that original slide talking about different forms of trauma, intergenerational trauma is the type of trauma that's passed down through systems, communities, and families, and it often becomes a cycle. So what this can look like is intervening and supporting those who choose to be cycle breakers, recognizing that the historical impact of trauma and what it takes to be a cycle breaker is really difficult. Two, socio-ecological healing beyond the individual. So this is considering how we heal relationships, communities, and society, so individuals are less impacted and less susceptible to individualized trauma over time. Three, and this is often a tough one, stop automatically blaming, shaming, and making monsters out of those who continue cycles of abuse. And this doesn't mean no accountability for abusers, but what it means is that we better understand the root causes of trauma so we can start to prevent those future acts. And lastly is learning good boundaries and how to set them to reduce codependency on others. So I'm going to wrap up today's webinar with a plug for Pineapple Support Services. So Pineapple Support offers, as most of you probably know, therapeutic support for individuals in the adult entertainment industry. Now, one subset of what Pineapple Support does is sexual trauma support. So Pineapple Support is, wonderful in that they offer 6 completely free one-on-one therapy sessions with specialized therapists for adult industry professionals seeking support after experiencing sexual assault or abuse. So if you've gone through this training and thought about your history and your experiences and some symptoms you might be experiencing, now would be the time to consider whether this sexual trauma support is right for you. If you're not quite ready for that individual support and what that looks like, or maybe you've already done some healing in that domain, but you're still experiencing some difficulties connecting with others, building relationships, Pineapple Support also offers support groups. So what they do is partner with industry therapists to provide online support groups in a range of different topic areas. So in May, there's a group focused on recovering from trauma and building resilience. Support groups really are a great way to gain support from others and with similar lived experiences. And lastly, of course, are webinars and workshops. So Pineapple Support offers monthly webinars and workshops focused on a variety of topics like this one. If you've gone through this training, and again, recognize that some of these experiences that I described in terms of acute trauma, complex trauma, intergenerational or complex trauma apply to you. Maybe you haven't even experienced a trauma yourself, but those around you in the industry or in your family system or down your bloodline have. Often what we find is that trauma survivors minimize their experiences. They don't think they need help. They don't think that what they've been through is as bad as what others have been through. If you're having those kind of thoughts, what I would encourage you is to just give it a try. And that could be 1 or 2 sessions just to work through maybe what you're thinking about. And you might find that it's really helpful and you can start to uncover some experiences that you maybe have been avoiding for quite some time. So to wrap up, thank you for tuning into Liberation-Informed Healing from Traumatic Experiences, sponsored by I'm Live, Adult Webcam Experiences.